I never imagined Thanksgiving would be the night I finally chose my daughter-in-law over my own son. Looking back, the shove wasn't what ended 31 years of keeping the peace in this family. It was my 6-year-old granddaughter's silence afterward. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Thanksgiving in Boise, Idaho, came early that year. The kind of cold snap that turned the mountains white before Halloween decorations even came down. My son Marcus's house sat at the top of a quiet cul-de-sac. String lights already up around the porch, smoke curling from the chimney. If a stranger drove past, they'd have thought we were the kind of family that had it easy. My wife Carol had been gone 3 years by then, and Thanksgiving without her still felt like walking into a room with a missing wall. Marcus had married Jennifer 2 years earlier, and I liked her more than I ever expected to like anyone who wasn't my late wife. She was quiet, steady, the kind of person who remembered how you took your coffee without being told twice. Their daughter, Sophie, was 6, all gap-toothed smiles and a backpack she refused to leave at home, even for dinner. In the truck on the way over, Sophie had shown me a paper turkey she'd made at school, feathers cut from old magazine pages and glued on crooked. "Grandpa Walt, do you think Aunt Renee will like it?" she asked, holding it up like a trophy. I told her Aunt Renee would be lucky to get anything so pretty. Sophie beamed. She didn't know yet that being lucky and being grateful aren't always the same thing in this family. When we walked in, the house smelled like sage and roasting turkey, a football game murmuring low from the living room television. My daughter Renee was already there with her husband Todd, their gift bags lined up under the tree in matching store paper, ribbons curled with scissors. Renee glanced at Sophie's paper turkey and gave a smile that stopped somewhere around her cheekbones. "Oh," she said. "Homemade again." Sophie's face didn't fall right away. "I made it myself," she said proudly. "I'm sure you did," Renee said, setting it on the side table instead of anywhere near the turkey centerpiece she'd bought at a boutique downtown. "That's sweet." Nobody corrected her tone. I'd watched this exact interaction play out in smaller ways for 2 years now. A comment about Jennifer's secondhand minivan, a joke about the community college where she'd finished her nursing degree at 29 instead of 22, a remark about how some people just don't prioritize things the same way. Nothing loud enough to be a real fight, just enough to leave a mark you'd have to squint to see. Every time. I told myself it wasn't worth ruining a holiday over. Every time. Jennifer let it go with a tight smile, the same one Sophie was starting to learn. Dinner started a little after 4. Talk drifted from Todd's new job in commercial real estate to Renee's upcoming trip to Cabo. Then, almost lightly, Renee looked across the table at Jennifer. "I still don't understand how Marcus ended up marrying someone who works nights cleaning up after strangers," she said, and gave a small laugh like it was a joke everyone was in on. Jennifer set down her fork. "Renee," her voice stayed even, "please don't." That was all. No raised voice. 2 words. My son Marcus, sitting right beside his wife, said nothing. He looked down at his plate the way he'd looked down at his plate 100 times before, when his sister sharpened her tongue on somebody he loved. Renee's husband Todd let out a short laugh into his wineglass. "Come on, it's a joke." "It wasn't a joke," Jennifer said quietly. That's when Renee stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. She crossed around the table before I understood what was happening and shoved Jennifer hard in the shoulder, hard enough that Jennifer's chair tipped sideways and she caught herself against the table edge, knocking over a water glass that shattered on the hardwood. The whole room went still. Jennifer didn't shove back. She didn't even raise her hands. "You'll always be beneath this family," Renee said, and her voice had gone cold in a way I'd never heard from my own daughter. "Get your daughter and get out of my parents' house." Except it wasn't her house. It was mine. I hadn't said a word yet, and already I felt something crack open in my chest that had been sealed shut for a long time. Nobody moved. I could hear the football announcer still murmuring from the other room, oblivious. Then I heard something worse than the shove, worse than the glass breaking. A small voice beside me. "Grandpa." Sophie's eyes were filling up. "Did Aunt Renee push Mommy because we're not good enough?" That question cracked the rest of the way open. I knelt down next to her chair and took both her small hands in mine. "No, sweetheart," I said, looking straight into her eyes. "Your Aunt Renee forgot what kindness looks like. That's not the same thing as you not being good enough. Not even close." Sophie nodded, though I could tell she didn't fully understand. Maybe she wasn't supposed to. Not yet. I stood up. Marcus still hadn't said a single word to defend his own wife. Todd had his arms crossed like he'd just watched his team score. Renee stood there like she'd won an argument nobody had actually been having. I walked past all of them to Jennifer, who was pressing her hand against the red mark already blooming on her shoulder where she'd caught the table edge. "You all right?" I asked quietly. She nodded, even though we both knew that wasn't true. I helped her up. Sophie slid her backpack over one shoulder without anyone asking her to, the way kids do when they've learned to read a room too early. As I reached for Sophie's paper turkey on the side table, I saw it had been knocked to the floor in the commotion, one wing torn loose from the glue. I picked it up carefully, folded the loose wing back against the body, and tucked it into my coat pocket. No goodbyes, no shouting. I just walked the three of them out to my truck. The drive back to my place felt longer than the 20 minutes it actually took. Snow had started falling in slow, fat flakes across the windshield. Nobody spoke for a long stretch. Finally, from the back seat, Jennifer said quietly, "I'm sorry, Walt." I tightened my hands on the wheel. "No," I said, and my voice cracked in a way that surprised me. "I'm the one who's sorry. I've spent 2 years asking you to be patient with my daughter. I should have been asking her to be decent." Jennifer didn't say anything else the rest of the way. When we got to my house, she just reached forward and squeezed my shoulder once before helping Sophie inside. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep on my couch under an old quilt Carol had made years ago, I went out to the garage alone. In an old metal toolbox that had belonged to my late wife's father, there was a worn envelope with my own father's handwriting on it, something I hadn't opened since his funeral almost 20 years back. Inside was one line that had always felt like advice before, and now felt like a warning. "A man who keeps the peace by staying silent isn't keeping the peace. He's just choosing who gets hurt by it." I read it 3 times, folded it back up, and put it away. When I finally came inside, my phone was already buzzing on the kitchen counter. Renee, twice. Then Todd. I turned it face down and went to bed without answering either one. The next morning, fresh snow had covered my back porch steps. I found the coffee maker had finished brewing on its own timer when I picked up my phone and saw 11 missed calls and 1 voicemail, my daughter's name across the screen. I pressed play. Her voice came through shaky. "Dad, please call me back." I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the untouched snow in my yard. For the first time in 31 years of being this family's fixer, I did nothing at all. I wish I could tell you that ignoring those calls came easy. It didn't. I stood there with a mug of coffee going cold in my hands while my daughter's voice kept replaying in my head. 31 years of habit told me to grab my keys and go smooth things over, the way I always had. Instead, I looked back out the window. Jennifer was already outside with Sophie, both of them bundled up, building the world's most lopsided snowman in the side yard. They were laughing about something I couldn't hear through the glass. For the first time and longer than I wanted to admit, I understood that my actual family, the people who needed me to show up for them, were standing right there in the snow. The phone buzzed again on the counter. I turned it face down without looking. Jennifer came in a few minutes later, cheeks pink from the cold, and set a wet mitten on the drying rack. "You don't have to decide anything today, Walt," she said gently. "I'm not deciding anything today," I said. "Then what are you doing?" I thought about it a long moment. "I'm doing nothing," I said, and for once I meant it as an answer, not an excuse. It sounded simple. It wasn't. Doing nothing meant refusing, for the first time in my life, to be the one who rescued everybody else from the consequences of their own behavior. By the 3rd day, another voicemail came in. Todd this time. "Walt, Renee's furnace is on the fritz again. She's saying it's freezing over there. Figured you'd want to know since you always handle that stuff." I knew that furnace. I'd replaced the igniter myself 2 winters back. Every October, I drove over and checked the filter, tested the pilot light, made sure the thermostat was calibrated right. Not because anyone asked, but because if I didn't do it, nobody would even notice it needed doing. I deleted the voicemail without calling back. That afternoon, another cold front rolled through the valley. Temperatures expected to drop into single digits overnight. Normally, I'd already be halfway to Renee's place with my toolbox rattling in the truck bed. Instead, I helped Sophie glue the wing back properly onto her paper turkey at my kitchen table, using real craft glue this time instead of the school's watered-down paste. She painted little dots on the feathers while Jennifer watched us from across the room with a kind of smile I hadn't seen on her face in a long time. "Grandpa," Sophie said, pressing a feather down with one finger, "is Aunt Renee still mad?" I set the glue bottle down. I don't know, sweetheart. Are we mad? No. Then why aren't we going over there to help? Kids have a way of asking the questions grown adults spend years avoiding. I sat down next to her on the bench. Helping somebody is a gift, Sophie, I said. It stops being a gift the second somebody believes they can hurt you and still expect you to keep giving it to them. She thought about that for a while. I think Mommy gave Aunt Renee a lot of gifts. She did, and Aunt Renee broke one. I looked over toward the window where Jennifer was hanging Sophie's mittens up to dry. Sometimes, I said quietly, people don't understand what they've got until it's already gone. That night, Renee called 4 times. I let everyone go to voicemail. The next morning, the local news was reporting frozen pipes bursting all over the valley from the cold snap. My phone buzzed again. Another voicemail, Todd sounding worn thin this time. The basement's flooding over here. We got a plumber out, but he's charging us holiday rates. Figured you'd want to know. I knew exactly why the basement was flooding. The main shutoff valve sat behind a stack of paint cans in Renee's utility room, and I'd taped a bright orange tag to it years earlier so nobody would have to go hunting for it in an emergency. Apparently, nobody had ever bothered to remember it was there. I closed the voicemail without listening to the rest. It hurt more than I expected it to. Not because of the water damage, not because of the money, because every single problem reminded me of another year I'd quietly handled something without ever once asking why nobody else in this family had learned how to handle it themselves. Jennifer noticed the weight sitting on my face that evening. You can still go over there if you need to, Walt. I know. You wouldn't be weak for going. I also wouldn't be protecting you and Sophie if I keep pretending nothing happened at that table, I said. She walked over and took my hand. I'm not asking you to choose me over your own daughter, she said. I already did, I told her. I should have done it 2 years ago. That weekend, I took Sophie sledding at a park near my house. She laughed so hard going down the big hill that she nearly rolled the rest of the way. Halfway through the afternoon, she slipped her small, mittened hand into mine. I like this Thanksgiving better, she said. I stopped walking. Even after what happened? She nodded. Nobody yelled today. Those 4 words stuck with me the rest of the day. Nobody yelled today. My 6-year-old granddaughter had started measuring a good day by the absence of conflict, not the presence of joy. No child should have to grade her own family that way. By the second week of December, the phone calls slowed to almost nothing. Then an envelope showed up in my mailbox instead. A property tax reminder addressed to Renee and Todd's house, forwarded to me by mistake because I'd handled that paperwork for years as executor of the family trust my late wife and I had set up. I looked at it for a long moment, then set it in a drawer. Not because I wanted them falling behind on their taxes, because it wasn't mine to manage anymore, and for the first time, everybody involved would have to deal with the responsibilities that had always somehow taken care of themselves. A few days later, I was out in my garage sanding down an old dresser when someone pounded hard enough on my front door to rattle the glass pane. It was Todd, his face tighter than I'd ever seen it. You've got some nerve, Walt, he said before I'd even said good morning. Morning to you, too, I said. Renee's a mess. The house is falling apart, bills are piling up, and you're acting like none of it happened. I didn't tell Renee to shove your wife, I said. That's not what this is about. No, I said calmly. I think it actually is. He ran a hand down his face. You've always handled this stuff for us. I know. So fix it. Those words used to work on me every single time. Not anymore. I can't, I said. His frustration turned into something closer to disbelief. You can't? No. You mean you won't? I didn't correct him. Todd stared at me for a long few seconds, then shook his head. I don't even know where any of this stuff is. The account numbers, the insurance, none of it. For the first time, I actually believed him. He truly didn't know, because he'd never once had to. I glanced back toward my garage, where a worn plastic storage bin sat on a shelf behind the paint cans. Inside it were 3 ring binders I'd kept filled for years. Every receipt, every repair invoice, every insurance renewal, every property tax payment, everything nobody else had ever bothered to notice needed doing. Maybe, I said quietly, it's about time somebody besides me learned where to start. Todd stood on my porch for a good minute after I mentioned the storage bin, looking past me toward the garage. What bin? The one that explains why you don't know where to start? I said. He frowned. I don't need a lecture. Wasn't planning on giving you one. Part of me wanted to shut the door right then, But another part remembered every year I'd stayed quiet because I'd convinced myself silence was the same thing as kindness. It wasn't. "Come inside," I said. Jennifer looked up from the kitchen table when Todd walked in behind me. She gave a small, polite nod and went upstairs to help Sophie with her spelling words. I noticed Todd's eyes follow her up the stairs, and I saw him catch a glimpse of the bruise still fading on her shoulder from the table edge. He looked down at the floor. "I didn't know Renee would actually—" "I know." "No," he said, swallowing hard. "I really didn't think she'd put her hands on anybody." I believed him. That didn't undo what had happened. It only explained a small piece of it. I brought the storage bin in from the garage and set it on my dining room table. Todd let out a short laugh. "You're kidding me." "I'm not." He lifted the lid. Inside were folders organized by year, going back over a decade, each one labeled in my own handwriting. He pulled the first one out. Property tax receipts. "You paid these?" he asked. "When Renee's job fell through that first year?" I nodded. He opened another. Roof repairs after the hailstorm. Then another. Furnace maintenance. Water heater replacement. Insurance renewals. Gas receipts from a dozen trips out to their place at 2 in the morning when something broke. Todd stopped flipping pages. His voice went quiet. "I don't understand. You weren't supposed to." "What do you mean?" "I never wanted either of you feeling guilty about it." He looked up at me. "So every time Renee thanked you for helping out around the house, she was usually thanking me for something you two never even knew was broken in the first place." He sat down hard in one of my dining chairs. "I thought you just liked doing handyman stuff on weekends." "So did she, I think." He looked confused. "What?" "I never wanted your family feeling like a burden to me," I said. "So I let you both believe everything just worked itself out on its own." Silence sat between us for a while. Finally, Todd asked, "How much?" "Over the years?" I leaned back in my chair. "I stopped keeping a running total a long time ago." "No," he said, eyes still on the receipts. "Tell me." I hesitated, then told him. "Somewhere around 60,000, spread out over 12 years, give or take." His head snapped up. "What? Give or take?" He ran both hands through his hair. "I had no idea, Walt." "I know." He picked up another folder from the bottom of the bin. Inside was a spiral notebook. "What's this?" "My log." I... He opened it to a random page. September 4th, replaced furnace igniter before cold snap. February 19th, fixed leaking shutoff valve, tagged it orange. June 2nd, cleared gutters after windstorm. Page after page, the same pattern. Dates, parts, costs, no complaints, just work quietly done. Todd slowly closed the notebook. "You came by this often?" "Usually once a week, sometimes more in winter." His face went pale. "I work 4 miles from their house." I didn't say anything because there wasn't much left to say. That's when Renee walked through my front door without knocking, the way she always had since she was a teenager. "I saw Todd's car outside," she said, glancing at the table. "What's all this?" Todd didn't answer. She picked up a receipt, then another, then set them back down. "Oh, please. You kept records." "I always have." She crossed her arms. "You're still my father. Kids are supposed to help their parents when they need it." "They are," I said. "So?" "My point," I said, closing the folder gently in front of her, "is there's a difference between choosing to help someone and someone believing they're owed it no matter how they treat you." She scoffed. "Sounds like the same thing to me." "It isn't," I said, meeting her eyes. The room went quiet again. Todd looked between the two of us, then down at the bin, his shoulders sinking another inch. "You never once asked us for anything," he said. "No. You never even mentioned any of it." "No. Why not?" I gave a small smile without much humor behind it. "Because I thought that's just what family did for each other." He looked like someone had hit him. "I should have helped." "You should have known there was something to help with." Before either of us could say anything more, my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen read Diane Whitfield, our family's attorney since before Carol passed. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. "Walt," Diane said, her voice measured as always. "I met with Renee this morning." I closed my eyes. Figured she'd get around to that eventually. "She has questions about the trust, specifically about whether she can challenge your handling of things as trustee." I almost laughed. "Challenge what exactly?" "Exactly," Diane said. "I told her you haven't exercised any authority you weren't already entitled to. If anything, You've gone well beyond what the trust document actually requires of you. Did she believe you? Not yet. A pause. Walt, I've handled this family's affairs for close to 15 years. I've rarely seen anybody do more than a trust required of them, let alone this much more. I look back toward the dining room, where Todd sat surrounded by more than a decade of paperwork. Renee had gone quiet. I think it's time everybody understands why Carol and I set things up this way, Diane said. After I hung up, I stood in the hallway a long moment. My late wife hadn't just left me responsibility when we drew up that trust together. She'd left me permission. Permission to eventually stop confusing sacrifice with love. When I walked back into the dining room, Todd looked up. What now? I looked at the bin, then at my daughter. Now, I said quietly, everybody in this family learned something your mother and I never wanted either of you to forget. I didn't explain further that afternoon. There was an old cedar box in my bedroom closet. One Carol had kept letters in for 30 years, and inside it was a card she'd written me not long before she passed, words I'd carried in my chest ever since. It wasn't time to share those yet. There were still some things everyone needed to see first. The next morning, I drove downtown to Diane's office. I hadn't wanted to go, not after everything that had already happened, but putting it off any longer wouldn't fix anything either. Diane met me with the same steady handshake she'd always had. Renee's already here, she said quietly. Todd insisted on coming too. That didn't surprise me. Diane led me into a small conference room. My daughter looked older than she had just 3 weeks earlier, all the usual confidence drained out of her posture. Todd sat beside her, arms crossed, still carrying himself like a man expecting to be proven right. Diane closed the door and opened a thick binder. I've gone through every document tied to the Whitmore Family Trust, she began. Todd leaned forward. Good. Diane continued without pausing for him. I've also reviewed the financial records Walt voluntarily handed over. Page after page turned. Property tax payments, insurance premiums, roof repairs, furnace maintenance, emergency plumbing. The room grew quieter with every page. Finally, she closed the binder. I've reached one conclusion, she said, looking directly at Renee. Your father has done substantially more than the trust ever required of him. Renee crossed her arms. So the trust obligated him to manage certain shared property responsibly, Diane said. It never required him to personally fund your household's expenses out of his own retirement savings. My daughter blinked. What do you mean? If Walt had acted strictly within the boundaries of his role, he would have stopped covering these costs years ago and let you and Todd handle your own home the way most people do. Diane let that sit a moment. Instead, he quietly absorbed those costs himself. For over a decade without ever telling either of you. Todd finally spoke. Well, that's what family does for each other. Diane looked at him for the first time. No, she said, not unkindly. Family helps because they choose to. What you're describing is entitlement, and those aren't the same thing. Nobody argued, not even Renee. My daughter stared down at the polished table. I didn't know, she said. I believed her. She truly hadn't known. Somehow that made the whole thing sadder rather than easier. Diane pulled out one more folder. There's one additional matter. She slid a copy of the original trust toward Renee. Your mother and Walt named him as sole trustee because they believed he'd make careful, fair decisions on behalf of this whole family. Renee looked up slowly. So, Mom knew he'd do this. She knew his character, Diane said, and gave me a small nod. And after 15 years of records, I'd say she chose correctly. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Renee pushed her chair back. So that's it then? There's no legal claim here, Diane said. If you filed one, it would almost certainly fail. Renee looked frustrated. But he just stopped helping. After what happened at that table. Oh, Diane's expression didn't change. A court would likely find that entirely understandable. Renee had nothing left to say. The meeting ended quietly. No shouting, no last word. Just people standing up one at a time, carrying truths that felt a lot heavier leaving that room than they had walking in. Outside in the parking lot, Todd caught up with me. I owe you an apology, Walt. You don't owe me anything today. I do, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I kept thinking you just like puttering around houses. Turns out Renee depended on you a whole lot more than I ever gave you credit for. She depended on the version of me that never said no, I said. I made sure it stayed that way. That's on me, too. He nodded slowly. I don't think I ever really saw everything you were carrying for us. We stood there another minute before going our separate ways. Life settled into a rhythm I wasn't used to after that. The phone stopped ringing every single day. Jennifer started laughing more easily around the house. Sophie stopped asking whether Aunt Renee hated them and started talking about her spelling tests again instead. One Saturday afternoon, she came running into my garage, waving a sheet of paper over her head. "Grandpa, I won." "Won what?" "My turkey." Her elementary school had held a fall art contest before the holidays, judging delayed because of the break. First place. Hand-glued feathers and all, the same paper turkey Renee had barely looked at. Jennifer read the letter twice, smiling. "I'm so proud of you, baby." Sophie looked up at her. "Do you think Aunt Renee would like it now?" Jennifer knelt down beside her. "I hope one day she understands why it mattered in the first place," she said. That answer stayed with me, not because it promised anything, because Jennifer still hoped, even after everything that had happened at that table. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow disappeared off the mountains. Life got quieter than it had been in a long time. One evening, while I was grilling out back, Todd called. His voice sounded different, worn down. "Renee wants to know something," he said. I waited. "She wants to know if she could see Sophie again." I looked through my kitchen window. Jennifer and Sophie were out back making lemonade, laughing over something spilled across the counter. The sight filled me with both peace and something close to caution at the same time. "I'll think about it," I said. "She knows she doesn't deserve it, Walt." "I know." A long silence passed. Then Todd said something I never expected. "Walt? I think she's finally starting to understand what she actually lost that night." After we hung up, I stood alone in my backyard until the sun dropped behind the ridge. A few days later, an envelope showed up in my mailbox, my daughter's handwriting unmistakable across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No excuses, no long explanation, just one line. "If you'll let me, I'd like to come to Sophie's birthday party in June." I folded the note and slipped it back in the envelope, staring at it a long while. Some wounds heal quick. Others take more than an apology written on a single sheet of paper. And some decisions shouldn't be made by the person who was hurt the least. I looked over at Sophie through the window. If anybody deserved to decide what happened next, it wasn't me. Sophie's birthday landed on a warm Saturday in June, warmer than the forecast had promised. By noon, my backyard smelled like charcoal and Jennifer's potato salad, and Sophie ran through the sprinkler with two girls from down the street, stopping every few minutes just to check whether the hot dogs were ready before tearing off again. Watching her laugh without checking over her shoulder every 10 seconds was something I still wasn't fully used to. Peace, it turned out, takes some getting used to. Todd showed up first, carrying a bag of ice and looking awkward standing near the gate. "You sure this is all right?" he asked. "I invited you." I wasn't talking about me. I knew exactly what he meant. Before I could answer, another car pulled slowly into my driveway. Renee climbed out alone. She looked smaller than I remembered her. Not physically, just older somehow. No expensive jewelry, hair pulled back simple, just a plain blouse and flat shoes. In her hands was a small gift wrapped in plain brown paper. For a moment, nobody moved. Jennifer quietly reached for my hand, and I squeezed it once. "It's your call," she whispered. "No," I said softly. "It's ours." Renee crossed the yard one careful step at a time. When she reached us, she didn't try to hug anybody. She didn't even look at me first. She looked straight at Jennifer. "I owe you something I've never given you," she said. Jennifer waited. "My respect." The words hung there in the warm afternoon air. Renee took a slow breath. "I've practiced this for weeks," she said, glancing around the yard. "Would anybody mind if I said it now?" Nobody objected. Todd quietly pulled out a lawn chair for her. She didn't sit. She unfolded a single sheet of paper from her pocket, hands trembling slightly. "I spent most of my life pretending I came from somewhere different than I actually did," she began. "Our family didn't always have money growing up. Dad worked 2 jobs most winters just to keep the lights on. I hated feeling like that. I promised myself I'd never feel that small again." She paused. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped being scared of being poor and started being scared of anybody who reminded me I used to be." Silence settled over the whole backyard. "I judged Jennifer before I ever really knew her," Renee said. I convinced myself where somebody came from mattered more than who they actually turned out to be. When Todd made jokes, I laughed along instead of stopping him. She wiped at one eye. And that night at the table, that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life. Jennifer didn't say anything. Renee turned towards Sophie, who'd stopped running through the sprinkler and was standing close to her mother now. I also hurt somebody who never did a single thing except love her aunt, Renee said, voice cracking. I understand if you never forgive me for that. She held out the small gift box. Jennifer looked at me. I nodded. She untied the ribbon carefully. Inside was the paper turkey, the wing that had torn loose glued back on. A little crooked, a small crease still visible if you look closely. Sophie gasped. That's mine! It was, Renee said quietly. I picked it up off your side table before I left that night. I've had it in a drawer ever since. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I couldn't make the wing sit perfectly again, but I fixed what I could. Jennifer looked at her. You kept it this whole time? Renee nodded. I thought maybe if I could fix the turkey. Her shoulders sagged. Maybe I'd eventually learn how to fix what I actually broke. Nobody rushed to fill the quiet after that. Some moments deserved to just sit there. Sophie looked up at me. I knelt down beside her the same way I had that night back in November. Yes, sweetheart? She glanced toward her aunt. Are you still mad at her, Grandpa? How I feel isn't really the important thing right now, I said gently. She frowned. It isn't? I shook my head. You got hurt that night too, in your own way. She looked back at Renee, then at her mother, then at me again. What happens now? I rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. That's your decision to make, not anybody else's. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked slowly across the yard. Renee stayed exactly where she was, didn't reach out, didn't ask for anything. Sophie stopped in front of her. My turkey isn't perfect anymore, she said. Renee nodded. I know. Sophie gave a small smile. Neither is our family. Then she wrapped both arms around her aunt. Renee cried quietly into her shoulder. Jennifer leaned against me. I wasn't expecting that, she whispered. Neither was I. A few minutes later, everybody finally sat down to eat. The conversation wasn't loud or forced, just careful. And somehow that felt more honest than every polished holiday we'd faked our way through in years before. After the food was cleared, Todd helped me carry the folding tables back into the garage. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have carried more weight over the years instead of leaving it all on you. You can start now, he nodded. I will. For the first time, I actually believed him. As the sun started dropping behind the trees, Renee came over one last time before leaving. I don't expect things to go back to how they used to be, she said. They won't, I answered honestly. She lowered her head. I know, but I'd still like to visit, if that's all right. With boundaries, I understand. No comments about Jennifer's job or where she came from. There won't be. And if Sophie ever feels unwelcome around me, you'll leave, I finished for her. Yes, she gave a sad little smile. I'd want that too, if I were you. When she drove off that evening, I realized something that caught me off guard. I didn't feel like I'd won anything, because none of this had ever really been about winning in the first place. It was about finally choosing the people who'd been quietly choosing me back every single day, whether I noticed it or not. That night, after the porch lights had dimmed and Sophie had fallen asleep with her repaired paper turkey sitting on her nightstand, Jennifer and I sat together on the back steps. You know, she said, resting her head against my shoulder, Carol would have been proud of how you handled this. I smiled. She usually was right about people, one way or another. She'd have told you to protect this family. I looked through the window towards Sophie's room. I finally did, I said. The strange thing about boundaries, I've come to learn, is that they don't always push people further away. Sometimes they end up being the only bridge sturdy enough to actually rebuild something the right way. If there's one thing this whole year taught me, it's that loving your family should never require anybody to sacrifice their own dignity to keep the peace. The people who really love you will eventually learn to respect where you draw the line, or their absence will show you exactly why that line needed to be drawn. If this story reminded you of somebody in your own life, thank you for sitting with me through it. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping everyone comfortable and actually protecting the people who matter most, I hope you know you're not the only one who's had to make that choice. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone isn't fixing what's broken for them. It's stepping back so they finally learn to fix it themselves. Love isn't measured by how much you're willing to swallow quietly. It's measured by the courage to say enough and the grace to leave the door open anyway. A cracked ornament, held onto and repaired imperfectly, can still mean more than one that was never broken at all. A small note for you. This story was written and imagined by AI purely for entertainment, though I hope the honest heart behind it still landed somewhere true for you.